Ed Sullivan told the truth about the 7 music legends who were really bad. The Ed Sullivan Show introduced the best musical talent of a generation into American homes. Families gathered around their TVs every Sunday night to witness the parade of stars that Sullivan had personally chosen to delight the country. His stamp of approval may send careers into the stratosphere, but Sullivan was a smart judge of character, even if he was known for being stiff and awkward when he met people. Sullivan saw what happened when the cameras stopped running and the genuine essence of these musical superstars when they thought no one was looking. Millions only watched the perfectly prepared concerts. A longtime producer who worked closely with Sullivan said that Ed managed a family program. He was almost obsessively worried about keeping his audience safe from everything he thought was wrong or dangerous. It wasn't only about stopping people from singing or dancing. It was about the performers' personalities. Sullivan talked about how worried he was about some musicians whose work he respected but whose behavior he considered troubling or even dangerous in private chats with close friends and in personal notes uncovered years after his death. These weren't only stars who were rude or writers who were hard to please. Sullivan grew to think that these performers had real darkness beneath their public faces. Tonight, we tell you about the 7 music icons that Sullivan privately called evil, talented musicians who made great music but whose behavior was sometimes disturbing, sometimes criminal, sometimes exploitative, and sometimes violent. These aren't just stories of rock and roll excess. They're unsettling tendencies that Sullivan saw early on and tried to protect his audience from in his own way. But first, let's look at the instance that shocked us the most. A founding father of rock and roll whose ability was only equaled by the scandal that would end his career for a short time and the unsettling accusations that would follow him for decades. When Sullivan found out the truth about Jerry Lee Lewis, he didn't just cancel his next show, he banned him for life. And it was before the strange deaths started happening. Jerry Lee Lewis is from Faraday, Louisiana. One of the killer's darkest secrets is Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis was the ultimate definition of rock and roll's deadly intensity when he performed on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1957. His hammering, piano approach, crazy stage antics, and songs like Whole Lot of Shaking Going On and Great Balls of Fire gained him the nickname The Killer and made him a possible challenger to Elvis Presley for the title of rock's greatest star. Lewis's spectacular career came to an end less than a year later when the British press found out the horrific truth on his UK tour. Lewis, who was 22 years old, had married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown. Lewis made things worse by lying about her age, saying she was 15, which is still very young but less obviously illegal. Sullivan was quite angry. A booking agent who worked on the show at the time said that he never welcomed him back. By putting Lewis in the spotlight, Ed had given him his personal seal of approval. Sullivan felt personally deceived when the marital scandal surfaced. He thought Lewis had made him a part of promoting someone who Sullivan thought was doing something really wrong. Lewis's career in the United States fell apart right away. Radio stations stopped playing his songs. Concerts were canceled by venues, and his fees for appearing went down from $10,000 a night to $250. He would eventually get his career back on track in country music, but the incident irrevocably stopped him from being a pioneer in mainstream rock and roll. Sullivan couldn't have known at the time, but over the next few decades it would become clear that the Myra Gale Brown affair was just the beginning of Lewis's problems with women. He was accused of physical abuse in all 7 of his marriages, and 2 of his wives died in ways that raised doubts. Jiron Gunn Lewis, his 4th wife, drowned in a pool not long before their divorce was official. And just 77 days after they got married, his 5th wife, Shawn Michelle Stevens, died from a methadone overdose. A historian of television who looked into Sullivan's career said that Sullivan had a 6th sense about artists who were dangerous. Sullivan's hesitation to take Lewis back wasn't just because of the incident. It was also because he thought Lewis had a serious character fault. Time would show that this instinct was right, as Lewis's life was full of violence, drug abuse, and tragedy. Sullivan's early observation of Lewis's disturbing personal behavior was one of the most important moral steps against a prominent talent by a host. Lewis was nonetheless a huge musical impact, and his piano approach and wild performance energy inspired rock and roll. James Brown's energetic performances amazed crowds, but Sullivan saw another side of him when he was backstage. Sullivan told his producer that man has a devil inside him. Sullivan was right about the godfather of soul's violent past. We are very happy to have James Brown on our stage for this show. So let's give a great welcome to a great talent. To James Brown, the Godfather's evil dominion. James Brown changed American music forever with his energetic concerts, groundbreaking funk sound, and unequaled work ethic. When he was on The Ed Sullivan Show, his dynamic stage presence and precise band made performances so compelling that Sullivan, who wasn't renowned for giving out praise, labeled him the hardest-working man in show business. This nickname lasted with Brown throughout his career. But behind the sequin jumpsuits and cape embellishments was a man whose behavior offstage showed a worrisome history of aggression, control, and crime that Sullivan apparently found very troubling. He made crowds scream and women fear him, said a former associate who worked backstage during several of Brown's Sullivan appearances. Ed was old-school entertainment. He believed stars should be grateful, humble, and professional. Brown was none of those things. He demanded absolute control, treated his band like servants, and had a god complex that Sullivan found disturbing. Brown's criminal history began before fame and continued throughout his career. His rap sheet included multiple arrests for domestic violence against different wives and girlfriends, weapons charges, and drug possession. His volatile temper and controlling behavior became legendary in the music industry, with band members subjected to harsh fines for minor infractions like scuffed shoes or missed dance steps. Sullivan allegedly said Brown had a devil's energy in him, recalled a production assistant who overheard a conversation between Sullivan and his producer. He respected Brown's talent enormously, but was disturbed by the stories that circulated about his treatment of women and his band members. There was something in Brown that Sullivan found genuinely concerning beyond typical star behavior. Perhaps most disturbing were the allegations of domestic abuse that followed Brown throughout his life. Multiple wives and girlfriends came forward with stories of brutal beatings, including his third wife, Adrienne Lois Rodriguez, who filed for divorce and multiple assault charges against him, then reconciled, only to die under somewhat mysterious circumstances in 1996 following cosmetic surgery. While Sullivan continued to book Brown due to his undeniable talent and audience appeal, staff members recalled that Sullivan maintained a professional distance from the performer that differed markedly from his warm relationships with other regular guests. Sullivan was trapped in a dilemma with Brown, explained a music historian. He couldn't deny Brown's cultural importance and musical genius, but he was deeply uncomfortable with aspects of his character. It created a strange dynamic where Sullivan would praise Brown's performances effusively on air while expressing private reservations about the man himself. Brown's musical legacy remains secure. His innovations shaped funk, soul, disco, and later hip-hop through extensive sampling of his work. But Sullivan's early recognition of the troubling aspects of Brown's personality proved prescient as allegations and criminal charges accumulated throughout the performer's life. Chuck Berry created rock and roll as we know it and a criminal record so disturbing that Sullivan vowed never to book him again. One performance was all it took for Sullivan to see what Berry's adoring fans couldn't. Let's turn him loose. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Berry, Sweet Little Three. Chuck Berry, rock's pioneer with a prison record. When Chuck Berry performed Maybelline on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1955, he was introducing America to a new sound that would help define rock and roll for generations to come. His distinctive guitar style, charismatic stage presence, and storytelling lyrics about teenage life revolutionized popular music and influenced everyone from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. Sullivan initially embraced Berry as an exciting new talent, but their relationship reportedly soured as details of Berry's criminal history and ongoing legal troubles became increasingly difficult to ignore. Sullivan booked him once and regretted it forever, claimed a staff writer who worked on The Ed Sullivan Show during this period. Berry was brilliant on camera, but Sullivan was horrified when he learned more about Berry's past and his ongoing legal issues. It created a real conflict for Ed, who believed in second chances, but also felt responsible for who he presented to American families. Berry's troubled history began before fame with a 1944 armed robbery conviction that sent him to a reformatory until age 21. His most serious legal issue came in 1959 when he was arrested for violating the Mann Act, transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines for immoral purposes. The girl had been working as a hat-check girl at Berry's club, and he had allegedly brought her to St. Louis to work at his bandstand. Barry was eventually convicted and served 20 months in prison. This conviction occurred during the height of Barry's popularity, creating a significant problem for Sullivan, who prided himself on presenting performers who upheld certain moral standards. While Barry would eventually return to performing after his release, his relationship with Sullivan's show was permanently damaged. Chuck Berry was a musical genius, but Sullivan couldn't reconcile that with Barry's criminal behavior, explained a cultural historian who studied early rock and roll television appearances. Sullivan was willing to forgive certain transgressions, but crimes involving minors crossed a line he wasn't willing to ignore, no matter how talented the performer. Barry's legal troubles continued throughout his career, including tax evasion charges and, most disturbingly, a 1990 class action lawsuit from women who alleged they had been videotaped in the bathroom of a restaurant Barry owned. He eventually settled the lawsuit for a reported $1.2 million. What makes Barry's case particularly complex is the undeniable impact of his music contrasted with his troubling personal conduct. His innovative guitar work, distinctive sound, and compositions like Johnny B. Good, Roll Over Beethoven, and rock and roll music literally defined rock music and influenced generations of musicians who followed. Sullivan was caught in the difficult position of recognizing Barry's revolutionary musical contributions while being deeply troubled by his personal conduct, noted the historian. It represented one of the earliest examples of the separation of art from artist that continues to challenge the entertainment industry today. Sullivan famously refused to show Elvis's hips on television. The real reason, not the dancing, but what Sullivan called a disturbing pattern with young female fans that left him deeply concerned about the king's private appetites. Peace in the Valley. Here is Elvis Presley. 4. Elvis Presley, the King's Controversial Court. Elvis Presley's appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and 1957 remain among the most famous moments in television history. Performances so electrifying that they helped transform American popular culture overnight. Sullivan initially refused to book Presley due to concerns about his provocative performance style, only relenting after competing programs featured him to massive ratings. Sullivan's decision to censor Presley by filming him only from the waist up during his final appearance has become legendary, a moment that perfectly captured the generational divide between post-war youth culture and the established entertainment guardians. Sullivan saw the worship and feared the man behind it, said a former Sullivan staff member. People don't know that Sullivan's worries about Elvis went beyond the way he moved his hips. Ed was really troubled about how young people, especially ladies, were almost religiously devoted to Elvis. He thought it was bad for him and may be used to take advantage of him. Sullivan's discomfort with Presley's impact exemplifies one of his most contentious assessments. Elvis was different from the other people on this list because he didn't have a criminal record or any documented incidences of abuse. But looking back at Presley's relationships has brought up questions about some of the trends in his personal life. Priscilla Beaulieu started dating Elvis when she was only 14 and he was 24. This is the most important thing to know. Priscilla subsequently said that their relationship was domineering, with Elvis telling her how to look and move. They didn't get married until she was 21. Biographers have also written about how Presley seemed to like very young, virgin women that he could shape to his liking. A cultural historian said Sullivan didn't know much about Elvis's private life, but he felt something was off about the way Elvis and his young female fans interacted. There was more than just moral concern about rock and roll. There was worry about the power difference between the adult male star and the teenage girls who looked up to him. What makes Sullivan's opinion of Elvis so remarkable is how it changed over time. Sullivan first didn't want to book Presley and then censored his performances. But later, he praised Elvis in public, telling the audience after one performance, "This is a real decent fine boy." This public support came at a time when Presley's management was trying to make him look better, which suggests that Sullivan's concerns were partly addressed by Colonel Tom Parker, Presley's manager, who was careful about how he presented Presley to the public. However, staff colleagues said that Sullivan still had private doubts about Elvis's effect on teenage culture. The historian said that Elvis is still a tricky issue on Sullivan's list. There is no evident criminal behavior or documented abuse in this case, unlike the others. But Sullivan's worries about the power imbalances between adult male performers and adolescent girl followers brought up issues that the entertainment business is still trying to figure out today. People liked Phil Spector's wall of sound, but Sullivan told his crew, "Keep that man off my show." Sullivan had already figured out that Spector was really dangerous decades before he killed an actress in his mansion. 5. Phil Spector, the sound of genius and madness. Phil Spector never performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, but his music had a huge impact on the 1960s. Spector changed the way pop music was made and made the soundtracks of a generation. He came up with the wall of sound production approach and was the driving force behind hits for groups like the Ronettes, the Crystals, and the Righteous Brothers. But behind that musical genius was conduct that was getting more and more frightening. It would finally lead to murder, which Sullivan apparently saw coming decades before it happened. "He made noises and ruined lives," said a music industry veteran who worked with both Sullivan and Spector in the 1960s. Sullivan wouldn't let Spector be a visitor even though he was very powerful. He remarked that Spector had a serious problem that went beyond the usual show business weirdness or arrogance. Sullivan's worries about Spector were said to have come from stories of how the producers controlled conduct in the studio and how he treated musicians badly, especially female singers. Ronnie Spector, the lead singer of the Ronettes and later Phil's wife, would later say that her husband kept her almost locked up in their mansion and threatened to murder her if she left him. A booking agent who worked on the show said that Sullivan hated his arrogance and wouldn't let him be on the show. Acts produced by Spector would appear, but Sullivan deliberately avoided giving Spector personal attention or credit. This wasn't just professional jealousy. Sullivan genuinely believed Spector was dangerous and didn't want to elevate him personally. What makes Sullivan's assessment of Spector particularly pregnant was how accurately it predicted the producers' eventual downfall. As Spector's behavior grew increasingly erratic and threatening through the 1970s and beyond, stories emerged about him pulling guns on artists including John Lennon, Leonard Cohen, and the Ramones during recording sessions. This volatile behavior culminated in the 2003 shooting death of actress Lana Clarkson at Spector's mansion, a crime for which he was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison, where he died in 2021. Sullivan had an almost uncanny ability to sense genuine darkness in certain performers, noted a television historian. His concerns about Spector went beyond disliking his personality or professional conduct. Sullivan seemed to recognize something fundamentally disturbed in Spector decades before it became impossible for the rest of the world to ignore. The Spector case represents perhaps the most extreme validation of Sullivan's judgments about performers' character. The musical genius who created some of the most uplifting, emotionally resonant pop music of all time eventually revealed himself to be capable of the ultimate violence, exactly as Sullivan had apparently feared decades earlier. Ike and Tina Turner brought the house down, but Sullivan noticed something chilling: how Ike watched Tina's every move. Behind the perfect choreography, Sullivan recognized the signs of abuse years before Tina's escape made headlines. 6. Ike Turner, the architect of musical and personal terror. Ike and Tina Turner brought explosive energy to The Ed Sullivan Show with performances that showcased both Tina's dynamic stage presence and Ike's tight musical direction. Their rendition of Creedence Clearwater Revival's Proud Mary remains one of the most electrifying performances in the show's history, demonstrating why they were considered one of music's most powerful live acts. Behind the coordinated stage show and musical precision, however, lurked one of music's most notorious cases of abuse and control, a situation that Sullivan reportedly recognized early and found deeply disturbing. On stage, it was electric. Off stage, it was hell, said a stage manager who worked multiple Ike and Tina Turner appearances on the show. Sullivan wasn't easily fooled by image. He saw how Ike controlled everything: the band, the eat, and especially Tina. The way Ike watched her every move gave Sullivan concerns almost immediately. According to staff accounts, Sullivan developed a warm relationship with Tina while maintaining a noticeably cool professional distance from Ike. This wasn't just personal preference, but reportedly stemmed from what Sullivan observed backstage and heard from industry contacts about Ike's treatment of his wife and performers. Ed loved Tina, but Ike's violence, control, and cocaine-fueled rages disgusted him, revealed a production assistant who worked on several of their appearances. Sullivan would go out of his way to compliment Tina directly, deliberately bypassing Ike, which was practically unheard of given Ike's controlling nature. It was Sullivan's subtle way of acknowledging what he believed was happening behind closed doors. What Sullivan apparently sensed became public knowledge years later when Tina finally escaped the relationship in 1976 and eventually revealed the full horror of her marriage in her autobiography, I, Tina, and the subsequent film, What's Love Got to Do with It? Tina described enduring years of severe physical abuse, being forced to perform while injured, and living in constant fear for her life. Sullivan booked them early on, but sources say he kept his distance from Ike, explained a music historian. This wasn't just personal dislike, but genuine moral judgment. Sullivan believed that Ike's treatment of Tina and others in his orbit crossed a line from difficult personality into something truly evil. Ike Turner's musical contributions remain significant. Many music historians credit his 1951 recording, Rocket 88, as the first rock and roll record, and his tight band direction created a distinctive sound that influenced countless performers. However, these achievements have been permanently overshadowed by his documented abuse and control of Tina and others in his orbit. Sullivan's dilemma with Ike and Tina demonstrates the complex moral calculations behind his booking decisions. Noted a television historian, he continued featuring the act because of their undeniable talent and Tina's star quality. But he made his disapproval of Ike clear in subtle ways that industry insiders recognized, even while maintaining the professional courtesy his show was known for. One word, one broken promise. The night Jim Morrison deliberately defied Sullivan on live television didn't just end with a ban. It confirmed Sullivan's suspicion that Morrison's self-destruction would eventually consume him completely. 7. Jim Morrison, the poet who defied America's host. The Doors' 1967 appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show was supposed to be a crowning moment for the rising psychedelic rock band. Instead, it became one of the most notorious incidents in the program's history and earned the group the rare distinction of being permanently banned from television's most important music showcase. The conflict centered on the band's hit song, Light My Fire, and specifically the line, Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher. Sullivan, concerned about drug references on his family program, personally asked Morrison to change the lyric to Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Better for the live broadcast, a request Morrison agreed to backstage. When the cameras rolled, however, Morrison defiantly sang the original lyrics, making direct eye contact with the camera as he delivered the word higher. It was a deliberate act of rebellion that Sullivan interpreted not just as professional discourtesy, but as a personal betrayal. One lyric, one act of defiance, total blackout, summarized a producer who witnessed the aftermath. Sullivan was livid. When the performance ended, he refused to shake their hands, something he almost never did with guests. Backstage, he told their producer, "You will never do the Sullivan Show again," and they never did. Unlike some conflicts that stemmed from Sullivan's concerns about performers' off-camera behavior, the break with Morrison happened in full view of the television audience. It represented a direct challenge to Sullivan's authority on his own program, something the host found unforgivable. Sullivan banned the Doors for life, called Morrison a walking ego trip on acid, revealed a booking agent who worked with the show. It wasn't just about the lyric itself. Sullivan believed Morrison had looked him in the eye, made a promise, and then deliberately broke it on live television specifically to undermine him. He saw it as a character issue, not just a creative disagreement. Morrison's defiance came during a period of increasing unpredictability in both his personal and professional life. His alcohol consumption was becoming problematic, his behavior increasingly erratic, and his performances more volatile. Within a few years, these tendencies would lead to the infamous Miami incident where Morrison was arrested for allegedly exposing himself during a chaotic performance, a charge that remained controversial and contested. Sullivan's judgment of Morrison went beyond the higher incident, explained a cultural historian who studied the relationship between rock musicians and television. He apparently told his staff that Morrison had something destructive in him that goes beyond typical rock rebellion. Sullivan seemed to sense that Morrison's self-destructive tendencies weren't just artistic temperament, but something darker. This assessment proved tragically accurate as Morrison's downward spiral accelerated in the following years. His substance abuse worsened, his behavior became more unpredictable, and his artistic output suffered. Morrison died in Paris in 1971, at age 27, becoming one of rock's most iconic tragic figures. The Doors incident exemplifies how Sullivan's judgments about performers weren't always based on criminal behavior or hidden misconduct, but sometimes on what he perceived as fundamental character flaws revealed in professional interactions. Morrison's willingness to break his word on live television struck Sullivan as evidence of a deeper moral failing that justified permanent exclusion from his platform. The Sullivan Standard: What His Judgments Reveal. Ed Sullivan's private assessments of these 7 musical legends reveal something important about both the man himself and the era he represented. Unlike today's fragmented media landscape, Sullivan served as America's primary cultural gatekeeper for nearly 2 decades, determining which performers deserve the massive exposure his program provided and which would be denied access to millions of living rooms each Sunday night. Sullivan's judgments were never purely about talent. He regularly featured performers with limited abilities but solid professional reputations, while occasionally restricting or banning genuinely innovative artists whose personal conduct he found troubling. This wasn't arbitrary moralizing, but reflected Sullivan's deeply held belief that with cultural influence came responsibility, particularly when that influence affected young people. Sullivan saw himself as having a contract with American families, explained a television historian who studied Sullivan's career. He believed they trusted him to bring entertainers into their homes who, whatever their artistic styles, possessed basic decency as human beings. When he discovered behavior that violated that standard, he took it personally, not just as a professional misjudgment, but as a breach of trust with his audience. What makes Sullivan's assessments particularly interesting is how often they proved prescient. His early concerns about figures like Phil Spector, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Ike Turner identified troubling behavioral patterns that would later become impossible to ignore. While some might attribute this to conservative bias against rock and roll's inherent rebellion, Sullivan happily featured numerous rock acts whose backstage behavior met his standards of professionalism. Sullivan's era represented a fundamentally different relationship between media and celebrity morality. Without social media to instantly expose misconduct and with powerful studio publicity departments controlling stars' public images, Sullivan's behind-the-scenes access gave him insights into performers' true characters that the general public often lacked. Sullivan wasn't always right in his judgments, and by contemporary standards, some of his moral boundaries seem outdated, noted a cultural critic. But he took seriously the responsibility that came with his platform at a time when television exerted enormous influence on American culture. His concern wasn't just about protecting his show's reputation, but about the cumulative impact these performers had on society. The passage of time has complicated our view of these 7 musical figures. Their artistic contributions remain undeniable. They created sounds, styles, and songs that fundamentally shaped popular music. Yet, their personal conduct, ranging from troubling to criminal, forces us to confront difficult questions about separating art from artist and about how we memorialize complicated cultural figures. Sullivan himself never fully resolved this tension. He continued featuring certain performers despite personal reservations while banning others for behavior he found inexcusable. These inconsistencies weren't hypocrisy, but reflected the complex moral calculations involved in his role as America's most influential cultural curator. In today's world of algorithm-driven content and fragmented media, Sullivan's role seems almost unimaginable, concluded the historian. One man making weekly decisions about which performers deserve national exposure based not just on talent, but on character. His judgments, whether we agree with them or not, make us think about questions that are still important. What obligations do platforms have to the artists they support? How do we balance personal wrongdoing with artistic brilliance? And in the end, how important should character be when we judge cultural figures?